The death of Alexander the Great was far more horrifying than you imagine. History books tell us that the greatest conqueror the world had ever known simply fell ill and died at 32. But what really happened in those final days in Babylon would challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient power and betrayal. The year was 323 BC, and Babylon's hanging gardens bloomed with exotic flowers, while its streets echoed with the celebration of victorious soldiers returning from the edges of the known world. But within the royal palace, a different sound would soon fill the air, the agonized cries of a god-king discovering that even divine blood could not protect him from the most human of fates. What transpired in that sweltering Mesopotamian summer was not merely the death of a king, but the systematic destruction of a legend while he still drew breath. The popular imagination has sanitized Alexander's death into something almost noble, a tragic hero succumbing to fever after conquering the world. But contemporary accounts hidden in ancient scrolls and recently discovered tablets paint a far more sinister picture of those 13 days of agony. Today, we strip away 23 centuries of myth to examine the unflinching reality of how the man who had never lost a battle finally met an enemy he could not defeat. Before we dive deeper into this dark tale, make sure to subscribe to hear more hidden truths from history that have been buried for centuries. Alexander stood at the pinnacle of human achievement in May of 323 BC. At just 32 years old, he had conquered an empire stretching from Macedonia to India, larger than any the world had seen. Contemporary accounts describe him as possessing an almost supernatural charisma. With heterochromatic eyes, one dark as night, the other light as the Mediterranean sky that seemed to pierce through to men's souls. His golden hair, which he wore in the style of his hero Achilles, caught the light like a divine crown. He had defeated the mighty Persian Empire, been proclaimed a living god in Egypt, and pushed his armies beyond the known edges of the world. Yet within this seemingly invincible frame, the seeds of destruction had already been planted. The transformation of Alexander from brilliant military tactician to paranoid tyrant had been gradual but unmistakable. The young prince who had wept at the tomb of Achilles had become a man who murdered his closest friend Clytus in a drunken rage, who had ordered the execution of his most trusted general Parmenion on mere suspicion, and who had forced his Macedonian soldiers to bow before him in the Persian manner of proskynesis. The psychological pressure of maintaining an empire through pure force of personality, combined with the physical toll of constant warfare and the increasing reliance on wine to dull both physical and emotional pain, had created cracks in the facade of invincibility. Those closest to Alexander had begun to notice troubling changes. His drinking had escalated from social indulgence to desperate necessity, and his famous tactical brilliance would give way to episodes of irrational fury. The signs of catastrophe began to manifest in early June of 323 BC, shortly after Alexander's return to Babylon from his disastrous Arabian campaign. Witnesses reported that the conqueror's skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor, and he complained of persistent fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. His personal physician, Philip of Acarnania, noted privately that the king's urine had darkened to an alarming amber color, though he dared not speak of such matters publicly. The man who had once marched his armies through the Hindu Kush mountains now struggled to complete a simple review of his troops without exhaustion. Most troubling were the omens that plagued Alexander's final weeks, events that contemporary chroniclers recorded with disturbing consistency. A convicted prisoner had somehow freed himself and sat upon Alexander's throne wearing the royal diadem, claiming that the god Serapis had commanded him to do so. Ravens fought and died above the palace, their bodies falling at Alexander's feet during a ceremony. When the king consulted the Babylonian astrologers, they warned him not to enter the city from the west, But Alexander, either from hubris or fatalism, ignored their counsel. The psychological impact of these portents on a man who genuinely believed in his own divinity cannot be overstated. Alexander had built his entire identity on the notion that the gods favored him above all mortals. Now, as his body began to fail, these signs suggested that divine protection was being withdrawn. On May 29th, after attending a banquet hosted by his admiral Nearchus, Alexander retired to his chambers, complaining of a sudden fever and severe back pain. What followed would be 13 days of deteriorating agony that would transform the godlike conqueror into a barely recognizable shell of humanity. The initial symptoms, a high fever accompanied by severe abdominal cramping, were treated with the standard remedies of the time, including bloodletting and cold baths. But rather than improving, Alexander's condition worsened dramatically. By the second day, he had lost the ability to walk, his legendary strength evaporating as if it had never existed. The royal physicians, terrified of being blamed for the king's deterioration, applied increasingly desperate measures. They forced him to drink a concoction of hellebore, a violent purgative that caused him to vomit blood and bile until he could barely remain conscious. Contemporary accounts describe how Alexander's famous voice, which had once commanded armies across continents, was reduced to barely audible whispers. By the fourth day, paralysis had begun to creep up from his legs, and he could no longer leave his bed. The man who had crossed the Gedrosian desert on foot now could not even lift his head from his pillow. What makes Alexander's decline particularly suspicious was the pattern of his symptoms. Unlike typical cases of typhoid or malaria, diseases often suggested by historians, Alexander retained full mental clarity even as his body failed. He continued to issue commands, dictate letters, and recognize his generals, even as he lost control of basic bodily functions. The paralysis that overtook him was described as ascending, starting from his extremities and moving toward his core, a pattern more consistent with certain poisons than with infectious disease. Plutarch would later write that Alexander suspected poison, though he never named his suspected murderer, perhaps knowing that such an accusation would tear apart the empire he had built. The gathering of generals and companions around Alexander's deathbed was less a vigil than a vulture's circle. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and others, who would later tear the empire apart in the wars of the Diadochi, stood watching their dying king with expressions that observers described as calculating rather than sorrowful. Each man was already planning his next move, considering which territories he might claim, which alliances he might forge. The dying Alexander, still lucid despite his physical deterioration, must have recognized the ambition in their eyes. When asked to whom he would leave his empire, his famous response, "To the strongest," was less a succession plan than an acknowledgement that everything he had built would dissolve into chaos the moment he stopped breathing. By June 8th, Alexander had lost the ability to speak entirely. The Macedonian soldiers, hearing rumors that their king had already died and that the generals were concealing it, demanded to see him. In one of history's most poignant scenes, the dying conqueror was propped up in his bed as his veterans filed past. Unable to speak or move, Alexander could only acknowledge each man with his eyes, slightly nodding his head in recognition of their shared victories. Witnesses reported that tears rolled down the faces of hardened soldiers who had followed him from Macedonia to India, men who had believed their king was truly invincible. The sight of their godlike leader, reduced to such helplessness, shattered the last illusions of divine favor. The final 3 days of Alexander's life descended into a medical horror that court chroniclers could barely bring themselves to record. His breathing became increasingly labored, each intake of air a visible struggle that caused his entire body to convulse. The paralysis had reached his diaphragm, making each breath an act of conscious will. His skin, once golden from the sun of 100 campaigns, had turned a sickly grey colour that witnesses compared to old parchment. The smell in the royal chamber became so overwhelming that incense burners were brought in continuously, though they could not fully mask the odour of impending death. Modern toxicologists studying the ancient accounts have identified several substances that could have produced Alexander's specific symptom pattern. White hellebore, commonly available in the ancient world, causes ascending paralysis and respiratory failure while leaving mental faculties intact. Strychnine, derived from plants known to ancient poisoners, produces similar effects. Most intriguingly, recent analysis of the timeline suggests that if Alexander was poisoned, it was not a single massive dose, but rather repeated smaller doses administered over several days, allowing the poisoner to observe the effects and adjust accordingly. This method would have required access to Alexander's food or wine consistently, pointing to someone within his inner circle. The identity of the potential poisoner has been debated for over 2 millennia. Antipater, the regent of Macedonia, who had recently been summoned to Babylon and likely faced execution for his defiance of Alexander's increasingly erratic commands, had both motive and opportunity. His son Cassander, who served as Alexander's cupbearer and who would later murder Alexander's wife and son, was present at all the crucial banquets. Cassander's unusual behavior during Alexander's illness was noted by multiple sources. He seemed nervous and avoided direct contact with the dying king, unusual for someone in his position. Yet even more disturbing is the possibility that multiple conspirators acted in concert, each protecting the others through mutual culpability. The circumstances of the final banquet have attracted particular scrutiny from historians. Hosted by Medius of Larissa, a companion known for his ambiguous loyalties, the gathering included only a select group of Alexander's inner circle. Multiple sources report that Alexander drank from a ceremonial cup, felt a sharp pain as if struck by an arrow, and had to be carried from the hall. While some historians dismiss this as dramatic embellishment, the specific description of sudden, severe pain is consistent with certain fast-acting toxins. The fact that no food taster fell ill suggests either that the poison was administered directly to Alexander's cup or that the taster was part of the conspiracy. What makes the poisoning theory particularly compelling is the behavior of the generals immediately after Alexander's death. Rather than conducting any investigation into the suspicious circumstances, they moved with remarkable coordination to divide the empire among themselves. Bodies of potential witnesses disappeared, including several of Alexander's closest servants, who might have observed something incriminating. The royal journals, which had meticulously recorded every aspect of Alexander's campaigns, suddenly became vague and contradictory regarding his final days. Most tellingly, Antipater, despite being elderly and having every reason to remain in Macedonia, personally escorted Alexander's body partway back to Macedonia before it was intercepted by Ptolemy and taken to Egypt. Yet, even if we accept that Alexander was murdered, the question remains whether the poisoners were traitors or liberators. By 323 BC, Alexander had become increasingly unstable, planning massive campaigns against Arabia and Carthage that would have required decades more of warfare. He had executed numerous loyal Macedonians on spurious charges, demanded to be worshipped as a god, and showed signs of the same madness that had consumed other absolute rulers. His death, whether by disease or poison, may have saved the ancient world from an even greater catastrophe. The generals who potentially conspired against him might have seen themselves as saving the empire from a tyrant rather than betraying a king. The preservation of Alexander's body became its own macabre saga. Ancient sources report that despite the Babylonian heat, The corpse showed no signs of decomposition for 6 days, a detail that has led some modern physicians to suggest that Alexander may have been in a deep coma rather than truly dead when the embalmers began their work. The thought that history's greatest conqueror may have been conscious as the embalmers prepared to remove his organs adds a layer of horror to an already dark tale. The body was eventually placed in honey and transported in a golden sarcophagus, though it would never reach its intended destination in Macedonia. As June 10th turned to June 11th in 323 BC, Alexander's breathing became increasingly shallow. The gathered generals and companions watched in silence as the gaps between breaths grew longer. Finally, as the sun set over Babylon, the breathing stopped entirely. For several moments, no one moved or spoke, as if unable to believe that Alexander the Great, the man who had claimed to be the son of Zeus, had succumbed to mortality like any common soldier. When the royal physician finally confirmed the death, the wailing of the Babylonian women, hired as mourners, filled the palace. But the Macedonian generals remained conspicuously silent. The mystery surrounding Alexander's death has spawned countless theories over the millennia. In 2010, toxicologist Leo Shep proposed that Alexander was killed by wine contaminated with Veratrum album, a plant poison that would produce exactly the symptoms described in ancient accounts. Other researchers have suggested typhoid fever, West Nile virus, or acute pancreatitis. Yet the timing of the death, occurring just as Alexander was planning new campaigns that many of his generals opposed, combined with the suspicious behavior of those who benefited most from his demise, continues to fuel speculation about assassination. Perhaps most intriguing is a detail recorded by Plutarch, but often overlooked by historians. During his final hours, Alexander reportedly tried desperately to reach the temple of Serapis, believing that the god could cure him. His generals prevented this, claiming he was too weak to be moved. But Serapis was specifically associated with resurrection and healing from poison. Was Alexander trying to tell us something about his condition that his generals did not want revealed? The priests of Serapis later claimed that the god had appeared to them in dreams, saying that Alexander would have lived if he had reached the temple, though whether this was truth or merely an attempt to enhance their temple's reputation remains unknown. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death revealed the fragility of the empire he had built through personal charisma and military genius. Within hours of his last breath, his generals were already arguing over the succession. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant, but the child's gender was unknown. His half-brother, Aridaeus, was mentally disabled and clearly incapable of rule. The empire that had taken 13 years to build would take less than 20 to tear apart completely. The wars of the Diadochi would claim hundreds of thousands of lives and ultimately fragment Alexander's conquests into competing kingdoms that would never reunite. The treatment of Alexander's family after his death provides perhaps the strongest evidence for a conspiracy among his generals. Roxana and her infant son, Alexander IV, were eventually murdered by Cassander, the same man who had served as cupbearer at the fatal banquet. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was stoned to death. His sister, Cleopatra, was assassinated. Every blood relative who might have claimed legitimacy was systematically eliminated. If the generals were innocent of Alexander's death, why did they feel the need to exterminate his entire bloodline? The thoroughness of this purge suggests that the conspirators feared revenge from anyone who might investigate too closely the circumstances of the great king's demise. Modern archaeological discoveries have added new dimensions to the mystery. Tablets found in Babylon and dated to the period immediately after Alexander's death contain unusual gaps and corrections in the official record. One tablet, partially destroyed, contains what appears to be a list of substances purchased by the royal household in the days before Alexander fell ill, including several known to ancient poisoners. Another fragment mentions a mysterious Egyptian priest who visited the palace shortly before the final banquet and then disappeared from all records. These tantalizing clues suggest that the full story of Alexander's death may have been deliberately suppressed. The location of Alexander's tomb itself remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Ptolemy hijacked the funeral procession and brought the body to Egypt, where it remained on display for centuries. Julius Caesar, Augustus, and other Roman emperors paid their respects to the preserved corpse. Yet by the 4th century AD, the tomb had vanished from history. Some scholars believe it lies beneath modern Alexandria, others that it was moved to a secret location when Christianity became dominant. The fact that the body of history's most famous conqueror could simply disappear suggests that even in death, Alexander remains surrounded by conspiracy and mystery. What makes Alexander's death particularly haunting is how it reflected the transformation of the ancient world. The age of hero kings who led from the front and claimed divine ancestry was ending. The future belonged to bureaucrats and politicians who ruled from palaces rather than battlefields. Alexander's death, whether by poison or disease, marked more than the end of a life. It marked the end of an entire conception of leadership and power. The generals who possibly conspired to kill him were not just murdering a man, they were killing the very idea of the divine ruler that Alexander embodied. The physical symptoms of Alexander's final days continue to perplex medical historians. The ascending paralysis, the retention of mental faculties, the specific progression from fever to paralysis to respiratory failure, all point to something more complex than a simple infectious disease. Dr. Catherine Hall of the University of Otago has recently proposed that Alexander suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, an autoimmune condition that could explain all his symptoms. Yet this theory cannot account for the sudden onset after the banquet, nor the reports of severe abdominal pain that preceded the paralysis. The medical mystery remains as impenetrable as the political one. Consider the psychological torture Alexander must have endured during those 13 days. Here was a man who believed himself descended from Achilles and Zeus, who had been proclaimed a living god in Egypt, who had never lost a battle in 13 years of continuous warfare. Now he lay helpless, watching his generals circle like vultures, unable even to speak as his empire began to fracture before his eyes. The mental anguish of maintaining consciousness while his body failed him piece by piece must have been unbearable. Some accounts suggest he tried to write messages in his final days, but could not control his hands sufficiently to make them legible. The question of whether Alexander was poisoned ultimately reflects larger questions about power, ambition, and human nature. If he was murdered, it was not by external enemies, but by those closest to him, men who had shared his victories and hardships for over a decade. The betrayal, if it occurred, was not motivated by hatred, but by calculation. The generals saw an empire too vast for one man to rule, a king whose ambitions would lead to endless warfare, and they made a cold decision that the death of one man was preferable to the deaths of hundreds of thousands more. In this light, the possible murder of Alexander becomes not just a crime, but a political necessity, a brutal recognition that even the greatest men must eventually yield to historical forces larger than themselves. The legacy of Alexander's death extends far beyond the ancient world. Every sudden death of a powerful leader since has been compared to it, every mysterious illness of a ruler examined for signs of poisoning. The paranoia that consumed Stalin in his final years, the elaborate food testing protocols of modern dictators, all echo back to that sweltering summer in Babylon when the world's most powerful man discovered that power could not protect him from mortality. The death of Alexander established a template for political assassination that has been followed for over 2 millennia, whether or not it was actually a murder. As we examine the evidence 23 centuries later, we are left with more questions than answers. The ancient sources contradict each other on crucial details. Modern medical analysis can support multiple theories. Archaeological evidence remains fragmentary and ambiguous. Perhaps this uncertainty is itself the most important lesson of Alexander's death. Even the most documented events in history can remain fundamentally mysterious, their true nature obscured by time, politics, and human fallibility. We know that Alexander died in Babylon in June of 323 BC, but whether he was poisoned by trusted friends or felled by disease remains a question that may never be definitively answered. The final image of Alexander that emerges from the ancient accounts is both pathetic and profound. The man who had conquered the known world died unable to lift his own head, surrounded by men already planning to divide his empire. His last coherent act was to hand his signet ring to Perdiccas, a gesture that may have been meant to indicate succession or simply a recognition that his earthly authority was passing. As the ring left his finger, so too did the last vestige of his power. The transformation from god-king to corpse was complete, accomplished either by the slow working of poison or the inexorable progress of disease. Today, when we speak of Alexander the Great, we remember the victories, the battles, the empire that stretched from Macedonia to India. But perhaps we should also remember those 13 days in Babylon, when the greatest conqueror in history discovered that there was one enemy he could not defeat. Whether that enemy was betrayal or biology matters less than the fundamental truth it revealed about the nature of power and mortality. The death of Alexander reminds us that all empires are temporary, all power is fragile, and all humans, no matter how great their achievements, must eventually face the same final darkness. Was Alexander murdered by those he trusted most, men who saw his death as the only way to save an empire from endless war? Or did disease claim him at the height of his power, a reminder that even gods made flesh are subject to nature's laws? The answer lies buried somewhere beneath 23 centuries of myth, propaganda, and speculation. What remains certain is that the death of Alexander the Great was far more complex, far more mysterious, and far more horrifying than the simplified accounts in our history books would have us believe. In those final moments, as the last breath left his body and the assembled generals stood in calculating silence, the ancient world shifted on its axis. The age of heroes was ending, and something colder, more pragmatic, and perhaps more honest about human nature was beginning. If you found this dark truth from history compelling, subscribe now to uncover more historical mysteries that have been hidden from the public eye. The past holds secrets that powerful people never wanted you to know.